This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's fundraising day today, and talk programs don't always get a lot of support, but it's still costly to do them. So we're looking for some help. I'm on the board by myself today, which is quite okay. It just a little bit more nervous, but the whole idea is to bring you information about local activities that are environmentally oriented. You do hear a lot about rail trails and greenways because we have tremendous resources there that we need to let you know about, and we need to let you know about them in many different shapes and forms. A little bit repetitive, but people often ask, would you please repeat that? And they ask that several times because it's complex and not easy to understand. It is also Easter, and we respect that, and we'll be doing something to keep memory of Bob Dodd together. He passed this week. So let's go into what has happened during the week. I was rather pleased to be able to, with David's help, to get a program from last week where we had Malawai people here, 6 different people, and they were interviewed on WEFT, on Prairie Monk, and they, there are limitations. We are a radio program, and to convert it to video, we sometimes get the superstructure in the way. And so, but still, people move around and you get to see their expressions. And then we dropped in pictures that were provided by Dennis Roberts and Scott Dorset and Chris, and I've forgotten Chris's other name. But those DVDs that we made for each member that was here had to be on a different format. They had to be on a PAL format so they could be reread in a more British type expression of video playback. We got to them before they left town on Friday, so we're rather pleased with that achievement. The program is already up on Urbana TV, public television, and it will be can be streamed on the computer, and it will be on YouTube along with the pictures. We're not sure that the TV program will be with pictures yet. This is part of trying to get information to people using YouTube. It archives, it gives us a record of people watching. It can be viewed at any time at your convenience, and you can stop in the middle of the program. That's not quite what we do at WEFT, so that's a help in the long run. WEFT, along with funding enough, will perhaps be archived so that you can archive, you can listen at any time that you wish. We're always on, otherwise on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. So, first of all, I want to say something about Bob Dodd. Bob Dodd was mayor of Champaign, and a previous mayor of Champaign, and prior to that he was a priest and involved in a lot of community activity. he had, after being in the priesthood, he married into a family of 5 or 6 children, and was a father to those children. And he was in charge of the city at a time when there was still money coming to be used for community activities. We used to ask for funding for Prairie, and it was kind of interesting because of most of the community action programs. We had quite a lot of interesting pictures to ply our cause. And that was kind of a relief for city people who were dealing with a lot of somewhat legal and detailed verbal communications. Bob followed through with us. He came to sites to see what we were doing. He was tremendously helpful over the years, and was a friend, and I could report into him various things that would happen to our prairies, which are always in a challenge, and he was always faced by difficult situations, the last one being a real estate invasion by people who just dug up the railroad bed for corn and soybeans, and he was almost, that was beyond his legal expertise in a way, because he was largely involved with community social and other type programs. He was a wonderful mayor and continued to be involved with community things quite a lot. So Bob's details, there will be a visitation on Monday the 1st, and that will be at Morgan Memorial Home in Savoy, and there will be a funeral mass on April the 2nd, and burial will be in St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery on St. Mary's Road. We say thank you to Bob for his work and help and interest and enthusiasm, and his spirituality over the years. We could discuss things that were more than just the pragmatics of doing things. There was the reason why you were interested in natural history and just the regular expression of humanity in relationship to nature. So goodbye, Bob, and thank you very, very much for your involvement. He was faced with pancreatitis and was hospitalized for some 7 weeks before he eventually passed. Turning to other things, we have a report from Pope Prairie. Pope Prairie, Bob Klein Burton sent me an email. There were people there who were burning fireworks. Fireworks are kind of interesting thing. They continue on through the year, and they always have a track record of doing quite a bit of damage. Well, they got into a junk pile, which happens to be perpetual along behind the cemetery at north of Rantoul. It's not the old Route 45, which is still there. It's concrete, and it's an easy place for people to dump things, including couches and chairs and furniture that's half beaten up, and a lot of building materials and trees, stumps and whatnot just get dumped there. It's not our territory, actually. We bought, as Heartland Pathways, 9 acres immediately to the east of the old road. But the road has a right-of-way in it, and that is just wide enough to allow people to dump. They dump on the right-of-way, but it all rolls over onto our prairie. So Barbara and her husband Brian have been up there putting in signs and just watching, and they came around probably about an hour after firing of the junk pile, which is not good to fire because it's loaded with plastic and things that are hazardous waste that get into the air. So Barbara called the police, and they came, and also the Department of Transportation, and some of them weren't able to come, but they came and put out the fire, but suggested that perhaps that corridor should be closed off. Well, in fairness, the Department of Transportation has closed that corridor off with fences, substantial fences at each end, and the site is an attractive nuisance. It's a term for a site that's very interesting, but it also can be a nuisance. And that's not an answer to put up a barricade, because very shortly the site is so popular that the barricade gets broken down. Putting stumps in the middle of the road doesn't help either. And besides, we need to get access, other people need to get access to the territory. There's nice remnant prairies nearby. So you hear about this from time to time, but this is what happened this week. And we appreciate Barb and Barnes' involvement there and getting the report to various people. It's an awkward place because Ludlow Township is in charge, but Ludlow Township is sort of in the boondocks, and Rantoul is the population base which creates the mess. So it's really Rantoul's problem, and it's also our problem. So just being there is helpful. So if any of you out there know about Rantoul Prairie and would like to just cruise by it every once in a while, if you take a bicycle ride, it's about 18 miles to 1 mile north of Rantoul on 45. You go through the cemetery and just ride your bicycle around a little bit, be seen, and disappear. Sometimes we have work days, and that brings people together, and we're hoping to get a small nucleus of people in Rantoul who will watch and take care of that prairie. It's not the world's greatest prairie. It's a teaching aid in a way. It's regrowth succession, because the site has had about 8 feet of glacial gravel removed, and the prairie is coming back from around it, and also from the remnant prairie on the railroad line and interurban lines, which are to the west side of the road. So those creatures, especially the ones that blow in and have recreated prairie on this gravel pit. It's like coming back from 10,000 years ago when glaciers retreated. Here we're speeding it up a little bit by perhaps seeding some, and just the movement of meadow voles and creatures across the territory, and wind has brought in plants that in the long run we hope will simulate what is more natural on the right-of-way of the railroad lines. We try to keep it somewhat to what we think it would have been in 1850 when people were beginning to settle here. So that's kind of interesting. We also signed an annexation agreement with Monticello for a mile of right-of-way, which has become a popular rail trail in Monticello. And at Monticello, I have to say that with the help of land trusts, they have purchased 80 acres of bottomland just south of and east of Monticello. For those that know it, it's behind the old sanitary fill area, and Monticello is going to work with the Land Trust to put trails through that 80 acres, and also they're going to work on the 8 mile of interurban line, which goes straight south of Monticello to Bement. It remains alongside the road. It's mown a lot, and too much, I think, but it's been retained. Apart from repairing one culvert, that 8 mile can increase the bikeway and greenway of Monticello region. We would hope that in the long run it would support a prairie population of plants and animals, but that is a matter of debate, because there's a feeling that mowing and keeping things neat and tidy is saleable for things like tourism, whereas if you think about it, ecology is not neat and tidy. It flows in and out and roundabout and has clumps of cordgrass here or monarda there, and it's a much more gestalt type of situation. So we have work to do there. On the other side of Monticello, from Monticello to Cisco, there's a chance that we will have a nature trail from Apple Tree subdevelopment, which is just on the other side of the Sangamon River, all the way to Cisco. We hope that that will also include the preservation of an old wooden elevator that the university owns, but it's on Heartland Pathways ground, which sort of reminds me that if people don't know what we're doing, we need to have a strategic action plan. So we've started to put together a strategic action plan which will deal with the like of what's going on around Monticello. Where can you ride a bicycle? Can you take your steam engine into Champaign? Can you take your steam engine west to Lodge and perhaps down the Norfolk Southern line to Monticello? Could you have a restaurant train that would 2 times a year take that 23-mile loop and come back to the Railroad Museum? These are things you need to dream about, and the strategic action plan needs to have a 500-year element. It needs to have a 250-year element, and it needs to have a 5-year element and a here and now element. Most people like to see something achieved right now. It's almost linear. You need to pick seed, or you need to prepare a railroad bed, or teach people the value of sites. So that sort of programming should be built into a strategic action plan. If you go down to the Sangamon River from White Heath, which is like 2 miles, Shady Rest is on the banks of the Sangamon River. It was a picnic ground. That should be stated. It's also a situation where if we take a railroad train historically down to the Sangamon and load water into that train from a water tower, which has the capacity to slowly fill when the train is gone, but then when the train comes, and especially if it's an express train, which will never be again, but this is the history of it, the steam engine needed water, so you loaded water in quickly from that tower, which was often square and above the train, and so it had lots of pressure to bring the water in quickly, and the train didn't have to delay too long. we would like to see a train there have access to the spring herbs which will be coming through, the Dutchman's breeches, the squirrel corn, the bloodroot, all the little creatures, the spring beauty, all those little plants that come right up to the railroad line. And so we have to think about talking to the railroaders who often need to have a clear-cut vision of where they're going and how they go. So how do we work with a variance to allow the railroad to go through the nature and have the trees even over the top, so you have a feeling that you're in nature? And if that is on an embankment, how do we have people walk down the railroad line and see these things too? Because the train might only go there 2 or 3 times a year. It's or in excursion times or things like that. It's special interest, but people can walk there anytime. So where do you get the ties to do that? Where do you make concrete ties because there's no tree ties left? It's a lot of work and a lot of dreaming, but we need to dream, and we need to let you know that it's there. If you turn around and look up the Sangamon towards Mahomet, you go through Lickskillet or Centerville, which was a town that was platted very seriously very early in the creation of this region, but never was built. So there are a few things like churches and early settlement buildings there, but it has a huge flatland, and that flatland is flooded, so it can't be used for agriculture. Sometimes it was used for agriculture. You put a levee up, just as Dutch do with their polders. So this is pulverization so that you can grow crops below the level of the river. That was possible when you had a horse and you could move out and around the trees and whatnot. But now that you have huge tractors that would sink into that sort of land, it's not cultivated anymore, and could be a bicycle way and a greenway if you're thinking about the Sangamon from way up near Dewey and Fisher, coming down to Mount Mahomet and down to Shady Rest or Lickskillet, and then Shady Rest, and then Monticello and on to Decatur. You're thinking about perhaps some trails here and there associated with the wiggly-woggly roads that go parallel, because although we have a Jeffersonian plat, which is north, south, east, and west, and very square, when you get to a river, your roads get to be moving around according to the landscape, which is kind of healthy because landscapes have contours, and plants and animals sort themselves out according to the contours. So it's nice to have some of that sort of natural road making, as well as the purely east, north, south, east, and west road making that was due to the problem that people could not find the land they'd bought when they bought land in Europe and they came. The survey marks might be on a tree that had now died or on a rock that had been now moved. So the attempt was by Jefferson, that's why it's called the Jeffersonian plat, was to create a grid that would allow people to find the property that they'd been bought sight unseen from overseas. So think about going with a bicycle all the way up to Mahomet and further up to Fisher and Dewey and north into Ford County, and think of interpreting it as you go from Mahomet to Fisher. You go past a lot of injectors, and what are they? Well, that needs to be interpreted. There are, under our landscape, which has been covered over with glaciation, there are anticlines and synclines where the earth has been crumpled some, and in the domes there's a place where you can inject gas and store it, so that much of the gas that goes to Chicago is stored in the geological synclines and anticlines that are under that area. So the interpretation of those little injectors are where we need to let people blow by on their bicycle but know what they're looking at. If you're coming into Champaign, if we are lucky, we hope that we may be able to get a recreational steam from the Railroad Museum, which is in the middle of this complex. How can we do that? How can we also have people riding or walking on a natural area into Champaign? How do we go through Champaign to the Kickapoo Trail, which is mooted to come from Urbana to Danville? And so we need to look at some of the challenges there, to remind you what bridges look like. I take people to one bridge in Danville that's 160 feet off the ground, and people aren't used to heights, so all of a sudden they're not walking across the bridge, they're sitting on their backside and scooting across the bridge, because if you look down, you're way, way down, and if you fall off, you'll die. So just a picture inserted into a strategic action plan would explain that, and the need for money to make that sort of bridge safe. Yeah, and it keeps going further. It expands. In Arcola, we have the state has bought an old Penn State railroad line, and it looks kind of useless because it was bought after people had consumed some of the area, so it's not contiguous. But once people like Monticello start doing things that are pretty interesting, then we can continue that interest, and so can other people. So strategic planning is very important, and then we need enough people to be interested in a strategic plan. That means that we have to be on YouTube and Urbana Public TV and on the web, so people can see what we're trying to do and why. This is some of the last undisturbed soil, and we have to explain to farmers that if they want to have a perennial soybean that they mow for 20 years, some of the bacteria and plants involved have to come from a natural area, and if they dig it up for corn, then that is destroyed, and they don't have that genetic gene pool, whether it's for agriculture or for medicine or whatever biochemicals we may want to get out of that thing. So keeping it alive is important. That means people. In the long run, it might mean that we might have a day where we might have perhaps 50 people come to the area and make a statement, because they're going to put in signs that say, before you plant this corn, and it's mostly corn that's attractive, then please think about how the organisms in here are valuable to your future agriculture, how herbiciding this will destroy that future. So we want to discuss those things, but you have to discuss those things with people who are interested, and people who are interested have to be able to understand. That means they have to get together, understand each other, let alone what they're talking about. And it's not easy, and it's not easy in a time when there's not a lot of finance around as a recession. So you have to do things on a shoestring. That can be done. Actually, in recession times, it's often the fact that large organizations that need bulldozers and high hovers and equipment don't have the construction money to do that. So a recession can be a helpful occasion for people who are trying to preserve old buildings or old, not so old, but the ecology of the area. We had an artist here the other day who came to inspect our little pocket prairie. It looks kind of sad at the moment in a way if you look at it as a part of a cityscape. But it's generating its prairie, which will come in June and July and August and September. So they were seeing the little prairie when it was under a bunch of snow. So you couldn't see the pathways and the bricks and the cut limestone and the some of the bricks. Somebody said, "Where do the bricks come from?" I said, "Well, uncover the brick remove the snow, and you'll see on it Boston." And it came from Boston, and it's a street brick which is kilned with enough salt to protect the outside layer, so it doesn't absorb a whole lot of water. It keeps dry. And now, street bricks are not regarded very highly because they need to be worked on. When you park a vehicle on a brick street that has sand underneath it as a substrate, then the brick will move. And if you're going to repair that, you have to take the brick up and perhaps turn it over and smooth out the sand and bring it back to the right height. That can go on for thousands of years. Some of the Roman brick streets in England are still being used this day, but they require a lot of manpower to do that. And it's much easier to take out the bricks and put in concrete. The concrete doesn't move, and it stays longer, but it doesn't ever stay as long as a brick street. So one of the things we were looking at was a brick street, where the bricks have been taken out and replaced by concrete. Where the bricks still remain, the bricks move and the asphalt that's on top of them cracks. So for an engineer, that's an anathema. That's not good to see those cracks and those potholes. But if you're a historian, you'll say, there's bricks underneath there, and they're moving appropriately. If you're in the art world and you're trying to sell your city as a art haven, then you might want to remove that overlying asphalt and let people see the bricks and let them perhaps work on them. That means that there has to be someone in leadership who knows enough about simple product of bricks. That sort of working task, when the bricks came out of the street just near the WEFT, we worked till 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock at night, because when the workers left, they left the bricks sort of somewhat shattered, but we picked out the good ones and used them for a trail in the little pocket prairie. The pocket prairie came about because there was a sign ordinance. There were 3 huge signs that were 30 feet long, and you could see them from University Avenue, which is a state highway. And the city especially did not want to have huge advertising signs all over, so they put forth a zoning ordinance that said the signs should be of a certain size. And they grandfathered those signs in for 10 years so that people had time to think about it and change to a smaller dimension. That left a plot of land that was kind of weedy, and we said we can plant our weeds, which are prairie plants, and that we did. And that's what was visited by the artists, because the artists are the ones that have to interpret. We do have a nice little CD that we give to people that tells people what it looks like in the summer. And we need people to do that sort of thing, to come and take our photographs of summer and put them into a CD, perhaps even put them up onto a Vimeo or a website, so that people can see what they can't see when they come on in time. That requires an artist that has a feeling for what are the roots like, what are the leaves like, where are the insects that are on them, how does this relate to the cardinals that live in the trees that are part of the prairie forest ecosystem. And we need artists who are not necessarily pure artists, but they're artists with an understanding of the ecology. That takes talent. It takes talent for a university to educate people with multidisciplinary access to understanding a public situation. There's public sculptors. You may add interest to this site by putting up a sculpted piece. And you may be a specialist sculptor, but you also may be a sculptor that relates that piece to the prairie. The advertising sign that remains, often will have a sign that is partially paid for by the United Way, or the sign company donating to United Way in a way. And that sign will have an orientation, sort of a green message that relates to the prairie. All these things are interactive and hard to understand, but it's most effective, and especially when you have a Congress and a Washington establishment that doesn't seem to be getting along with each other very well. If you start off at the bottom level and do things and integrate at a local level, it's amazing what can happen sometimes, and in a very exciting manner. I went to a meeting the other night of the Milwaukee people, and there was community action there that was probably, I would think, 300 people, and people interacting. We need those sorts of things to happen, and that has to happen in relationship to a strategic action plan. One of the things that I thought might be interesting is that when you go out in the boondocks, the prairie is challenged by farmers who have been educated to see, to take their land. They're perhaps been here 6 generations, and they've taken out all the prairie and replaced it with the plants that you're trying to save on this very minimal little piece of undisturbed soil. It's like 0.001% of what was here in the early stages, because the prairie soil is so rich that it's valuable for things other than the nature. So how do we go about educating people who are genuine farmers who own a lot of land adjacent to our railbeds? Well, I grew up with some of this sort of thing. I went to a boarding school which was an agricultural high school, and that agricultural high school started me thinking about the biology that was behind the agriculture. When I graduated from high school, I went to university agriculture, and the agriculture in a university is oriented, one, to extension and education, so you can get a 3-year degree there, or you can get a 4-year degree, which is more oriented to research, which we need tremendously, but we also need the extension side where people go out and talk to farmers and appreciate and help them to appreciate what we're trying to do in the face of legal battles that are serious enough that we need lawyers that are land use lawyers and lawyers who understand the ecology that we're trying to save. I went on to teach in an agricultural high school, and then to teach in an agricultural college. And that was sort of an applied situation. Very different from the university. The colleges tend to have more applied information, so that when you leave the college, you know the plants and the animals that you're going to work with and how you're going to drive a tractor and that sort of thing. Whereas the theoretical university people are more likely to say, well, I don't know what that is, I'll find out. And the difference is that the university people will be always up to date because they know how to find out information. The applied people are not quite so oriented, and what they have this year may be out of date in 5 years' time. So what has happened in the British system or in the Australian system with those sorts of colleges is that they've been converted to red brick universities, which are still relatively applied, but they give more of a theoretical base so that you can understand the mathematics, the chemistry, the physics behind the biology that you're trying to save. And that, I think, has been very good, and it also allows those colleges to take in other disciplines like nursing and teaching, and they might be a little applied too, but there's a range of colleges and universities in Australia. For instance, the University of Sydney is more the theoretical type of institution. The University of New South Wales is a little more applied. The college, the Hawkesbury College that I taught at, was more likely to be out in the field talking to farmers and explaining the use of fertilizers, herbicides, and doing research, but sort of on the applied side of things. The same sort of thing happens in the United States. We have had cow colleges, institutions that were put up mainly to bring agriculturalists and engineers together so that they could drain the swampy lands. The University of Illinois is such a college, and they would help people like Frieslanders and Deutschlanders that came from Germany and behind Holland who knew how to drain swampy land. If you're looking at that moraine, that little hill that's high enough to not be noticed, the water runs off into an outwash plain which was very, very wet. But they figured that this could be drained, and they made little rivers. They're clever enough to put in a big puddle hole into which they would put a flat-bottomed boat with a crane on it. And this drag crane could make a river by putting dirt onto the levees on either side and gradually working their way down the landscape so that the water could move away. There were lots of different variations of these. There were some plows that were huge. It was drawn by oxen rather than by horses, because oxen have cloven hooves and can handle that sort of situation. So there were alternatives. But basically, 6 generations ago, people came to Champaign County, and they could do this, but gradually they could get the help of a university extension officer that would come, and then they could perhaps go to the university and do seminars in wintertime and understand what they were doing and why, and they would encounter people who bred new plants. For instance, in 1936, there was really no soybean here. So people went out around the world, and before 1936, and gathered up glycine, which is the name for botanical name for soybean. And so they went to all sorts of different places to get soybean relatives, and those were bred. And by 1936, you had soybeans as a crop. The soybean is a legume. It has rhizobacteria on its roots, and those rhizobacteria have to be adjudicated for their successful conversion of nitrogen into the legume plant. So a researcher who is on the applied side would have a room full of little slopes or petri dishes that would grow plants in contact with different bacteria, and some would be more effective than others. And so you can take a little plant that is 2 inches high that you might find in the Sahara Desert and find it growing 2 feet high in east central Illinois and producing a lot of seed and food that is healthy. So the colleges of agriculture and engineering and education were all part of the land-grant universities. The land-grant universities have more recently become very research-oriented in a very powerful manner, so that they're worldwide high-quality institutions that do this sort of work. But in amongst that speciality, you get integration across the board. And I often like to give the example of climate research, which is involves a lot of different institutions and brings artists, not necessarily as an artist that comes and then goes, but an artist that comes and integrates into the physics and the biology of climates. So the like of Beckman Center encourages that sort of thing. So behind our strategic action plan is the advisors who are University of Illinois or the Natural History Survey and private organizations like the Nature Conservancy or the Land Trust. These are groups that come together and they bounce off of each other. And it's almost impossible for people that are individuals to do this sort of thing by themselves. So you have to have people who get together. How you do that is a real challenge. You can do it at the city building, you can do it at the county level, you can do it with Sierra Club or Isaac Walton League, Audubon, but you have to retain your own dignity. Certain groups will have certain characteristics, like the Sierra Club will like to engage in a little bit of politics, so they have to have a certain organization. Audubon is more likely to be working with birds and science and children and lands that would increase their understanding of nature. But there's a construct that brings those people together, and we need a strategic action plan that will bring those people together and focus on what Heartland Pathways does. And Heartland Pathways is going to have its own way of doing things, and but hopefully the 33-mile, or about 350 acres of ground that we have, will be retained as relatively undisturbed territory that can support the like of a snake or a Franklin ground squirrel or an insect or a pollinator that is really essential to the farming that's going on around in either side, except that it's not always realized. So then you have to have that group of people that get together and do extension work, go out in the field and talk to people and appear at the local community event and go to city meetings or village meetings or just talk to individuals. I can remember the day when I was talking to someone who was a little upset that our railroad beds grew trees that spread over and shaded his land. And after a while we got to talking about agriculture and things, and we got to be very friendly, and he pulled out of his pickup truck glove box a map of the nearby cemetery where all his relatives were buried, and we just had a fine time. So you can change thoughts and concerns. I'm interested in the co-op food, the Common Ground food store, which has expanded recently, and some of the elements of that are the same, bringing people together. It costs more to get food at the co-op, but you're supporting an idea where you might go out and help with farmers to do organic farming, to raise organic animals and the like. We encourage that, and we find that often it works very well. You get a little grant here and do other things. So as we walked around town with the artists the other day, we were looking at the built landscape. So how does the built landscape relate to the nature and the food and the industry that is in the city? Well, there are little elements. There is the building structures. What is old? What was the railroad when it came here? How did the railroad come? When did it come? On what sort of rails did it come? Where was it located? And it's a little bit amazing for some people to know that, for instance, our underpasses are there because in 1928 there were a whole lot of trains coming by, and people were by that time getting to have cars, and they were objecting to being held up by trains going through. So the railroaders had a problem. They had a hill in Paxton, which is a glacial moraine, and they sometimes had to have a pusher engine to help trains go up and over this hill. So why not make a cutting and bring the dirt down to Champaign? And that's what they did. So over there you have underpasses where the train went east of the railroad station rather than the west. The regular line used to go through next door to where the MTD building is. So now you have it on the west side where there was a new embankment high enough to run underneath. And we're going to have another one of those at Curtis Road, because there has been an outlet put onto 57 that comes through on Curtis Road, and there's the same objection. How can we get across the railroad line when the railroads are doing very well and there's a lot of trains, and some of them are 140 cars long, and it takes you 10 minutes before the train's gone by, and by that time you've got a whole load of people behind you and they can't get through the lights in time, and da-da-da-da-da-da. So they're going to lift the railroad line up 7 feet and east 25 feet and do something the same as they did in downtown Champaign. And that will let you run traffic and run railroads at the same time. But to create that sort of empathy and to say to engineers, excuse us, but we have 50 feet of prairie there, and if you make it 25 feet wider, it may be taken over by hot dog stands, and we don't want that. We want the prairie to stay. So how can you help us do that? That means that the engineer that we're talking to has to have a background in biology that he doesn't always have. He would rather clear the corridor and put back what you want, but it might take 1,000 years to put it back. So don't destroy it, please. Can we work with you so that there's this interaction? If you're going to have to destroy a prairie, can we salvage it and put it elsewhere? So I think that's enough to remind you that we're active and interested, and especially interested in doing a plan, a long-range plan, and very long-range plan, and a very short plan where people can understand it. And I'm going to let you know that this is WEFT, WEFT, 90.1 on your FM line. And I'm encouraging you to call in. I'll be off the board. Music event will be shortly here. And you can call in and let us know that you want this sort of thing to be heard. Do you want to help pay for archiving? It costs to run a board, to have people here, and it needs organization and leadership to have perhaps 75 disc jockeys to come in, air shifters. How can you help? Even $10, $15, $40, $65 would be a help to keep this show on the road in a recession. Not an easy time to raise money. But we have airwaves, we go 50 miles, and we're streamed, and we have Better Public Television working with us to put this up on YouTube. Can you help us in any way? Please give us a chance to continue this work and help the region. We're mainly involved locally, but we also spread to about 8 counties with a lot of our work. We, for instance, go down to Arcola, where there is a Penn Central line that goes through that could be saved, or it could also be sold off to farmers. When the state isn't, doesn't have much money, it's a temptation to sell off a piece of land that is probably 20, 30 miles long and narrow and thin and not known by a lot of people. So